There are moments when a person thinks they are simply being forgotten, when in reality, something unseen is quietly being decided in the heart of someone they love. This is a fictional spiritual story, created for inspiration and entertainment, but tonight, imagine yourself standing inside that moment, where one unanswered question has followed you longer than you want to admit. Why did the person you cared about suddenly become distant when everything seemed to be moving closer? You noticed the little things first. A message that normally arrived before sunrise came hours later. A familiar warmth disappeared from their voice. Conversations became shorter, not colder exactly, but strangely careful, as though every word had to pass through a private filter before reaching you. You told yourself not to overthink it. Maybe they were tired. Maybe life had become complicated. Maybe you had imagined the change because you cared too much. But then one evening, something happened that made your heart pause. You sent them a simple message. Nothing dramatic. Nothing demanding. Just 4 words. I hope you're okay. The message was read almost immediately. And yet there was no response. 10 minutes became an hour. The hour became midnight. And somewhere between checking your phone and putting it face down beside you, you wondered whether they had finally stopped choosing you. What you didn't know was that they were sitting alone in their own room, staring at those same 4 words. Their phone rested in their hand. Their eyes moved over your message again. I hope you're okay. They whispered, why do you still care? And that question frightened them more than silence ever could. Because they had been testing something. Not your patience. Not whether you would chase them. Not whether you would send 20 messages demanding an explanation. They had been testing something much deeper. They wanted to know what remained when they stopped making it easy for you to love them. For days, they had watched carefully. They noticed whether you asked about their day without expecting anything in return. They noticed whether you remembered small details they had mentioned weeks earlier. They noticed whether your kindness disappeared whenever you didn't receive immediate affection. And every observation created another question inside them. Was your love connected to what they could give you? Or was there something genuine underneath it? You had no idea any of this was happening. You were simply living your life, carrying your own responsibilities, wondering why someone who once seemed certain had suddenly become difficult to reach. Then came the first twist. They deliberately created distance. One afternoon, they saw you across a crowded place. People moved between you. Conversations blended into a low murmur. Somewhere nearby, coffee was being poured into paper cups, and the air smelled faintly of rain from the storm that had passed earlier. They could have walked toward you. They didn't. Instead, they watched. They wanted to see whether you would notice. You did. Your eyes met theirs for less than 2 seconds. Something passed between you that neither of you could explain. You almost smiled. They looked away. And instead of following them, you stayed where you were. That tiny decision became enormous in their mind. Because they had expected you to run after them. You didn't. For the first time, they wondered if they had misunderstood you completely. That night, they told someone close to them, maybe they don't love me as much as I thought. The person beside them looked at them quietly and asked, or maybe they finally learned not to force someone to stay. The room went silent. Those words struck deeper than expected. Because there was a truth your soulmate had been avoiding. They weren't really testing whether you loved them. They were testing whether you would abandon yourself to prove that love. And somewhere inside, they already knew the answer mattered. Meanwhile, you were beginning to change. Not because you had stopped caring. Because you were tired of trying to decode silence. You began giving the situation room to breathe. You stopped checking your phone every few minutes. You stopped writing messages and deleting them. You stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations in your head. And strangely, the moment you stopped chasing clarity, clarity began moving toward you. 3 days later, your soulmate opened an old conversation between you. They scrolled past ordinary memories. A joke neither of you remembered telling. A picture from a day you had almost forgotten. A message where you had encouraged them when they were struggling, even though you had been dealing with your own problems at the time. They stopped there. Their thumb rested against the screen. They remembered something you had said. You don't have to pretend you're strong around me. They read it again. And suddenly, the test they had created began turning back on them. Because they realized you had never asked them to perform happiness for you. You had never demanded perfection. You had never required them to be easy to love. You had simply wanted honesty. And that realization opened a door they had kept locked for a very long time. Behind that door was a memory they had never told you. Months earlier, before the distance began, someone had asked them a question about you. What happens if they see the real you? Your soulmate had laughed at the time. But they never forgot the question. Because they were afraid you would eventually discover something about them that made them feel unworthy of being loved. So instead of letting you get close enough to discover it naturally, they began creating little tests. A delayed reply. A cancelled plan. A quiet weekend. A moment when they appeared uninterested just to see whether you would demand reassurance. And each time, you surprised them. You didn't respond perfectly. You were human. Sometimes you were hurt. Sometimes you became quiet. Sometimes you needed space. But you didn't punish them. You didn't humiliate them. You didn't turn their vulnerability into a weapon. And slowly, something inside them began breaking apart. Not their love. Their fear. One evening, they sat in their car long after arriving home. The engine had been turned off. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Streetlights blurred across the glass. They held their phone in one hand and stared at your name. They had typed a message. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that one too. Finally, they wrote. I need to tell you something. Their finger hovered over send. Then they stopped. Because they realized that if they told you the truth, everything would change. The secret wouldn't simply explain their behavior. It would reveal why they had been afraid of your love in the first place. They put the phone down. Closed their eyes. And for the first time, they admitted something privately that they had never been brave enough to say aloud. I wasn't testing whether they would stay. A long breath escaped them. I was testing whether I was worth staying for. That was the moment the entire meaning of their secret changed. Because the person you thought was pulling away from you may have been wrestling with the belief that anyone who truly knew them would eventually leave. And now you were standing at the edge of that hidden truth without even knowing it existed. But there was one more discovery. Something they found while looking through an old message changed the way they saw you completely. It was a message you had sent during a difficult period in their life. They had forgotten about it. You hadn't. The message wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't promise forever. It simply said that whatever happened, you hoped they would eventually become comfortable being themselves. They stared at those words for a long time. Then they began to cry. Not because they were heartbroken. Because they finally understood. You hadn't been trying to win them. You had been trying to know them. And there is a difference between being wanted and being understood. One can make the heart feel desired. The other can make the heart feel safe. That night, they made a decision. They would stop testing you. But they didn't yet know how to tell you why. The next morning, your phone lit up. Their name appeared on the screen. For several seconds, you simply stared at it. Then another message arrived. Can we talk? Your heart tightened. You opened it. There was no explanation. No apology. No attempt to soften what came next. Only one sentence. I found something you said a long time ago, and I finally understand what you meant. You read it twice. Then a third time. Before you could respond, another message appeared. This isn't about whether you love me anymore. Your breathing slowed. The typing bubble appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Then finally, the words arrived. It's about the reason I was so afraid to let you love me. And just when you thought the secret was finally about to be revealed, they sent one last message. Because before I ever met you, someone taught me that being truly known always ends with being left. You stared at the screen. The room around you became strangely quiet. And suddenly, every unanswered question from the past few weeks seemed to point toward something much bigger than a simple test. They hadn't been measuring your love. They had been standing at the doorway of their own deepest wound, wondering whether they could finally trust someone enough to walk through it. Then your phone vibrated again. This time, there was an attachment. One old photograph. One person in the photograph you didn't recognize. And beneath it, a sentence that made your heart stop. This is the reason I tested you, and you need to know what happened the night this picture was taken. You opened the photograph. And the moment you saw who was standing beside them, you realized the secret was far more personal than you had ever imagined. The truth was no longer waiting somewhere in the future. It was already in your hands. And you were about to discover why your soulmate had been watching your love so carefully, long before you ever knew they were watching at all. The photograph was older than you expected. The edges had softened with time, and one corner was bent as though someone had carried it for years before finally hiding it away. Your soulmate stood near the center, younger than you had ever seen them, wearing an expression you barely recognized. There was no guarded smile. No carefully controlled eyes. They looked open. Almost innocent. But the person standing beside them was what held your attention. You knew that face. Not personally. But you had seen it before. A name surfaced in your memory, attached to an old story your soulmate had once mentioned and then quickly changed the subject about. You looked back at the message. This is the reason I tested you. Your fingers tightened around the phone. Then another message appeared. I never told you the whole story. For a moment, you didn't know whether to respond or wait. You chose to wait. And perhaps that was exactly what they needed. Because on the other side of the city, your soulmate was sitting at a kitchen table with the photograph in front of them, preparing to finally say something they had spent years avoiding. The person in the picture had once been the closest person in their life. Not a secret lover. Not a rival. Someone who had known their fears before you ever knew their name. Someone who had promised, I will never leave when things get difficult. And then, one night, everything changed. Your soulmate had trusted that promise completely. Until circumstances became complicated. Until vulnerability became inconvenient. Until the person they trusted most chose distance instead of understanding. That experience left behind a belief that quietly followed them into every relationship afterward. People loved the version of you that was easy to hold. But when they discovered the complicated parts, they eventually walked away. That was the belief your soulmate had been carrying when they met you. And suddenly, their strange behavior made sense. The delays. The hesitation. The sudden distance after moments of closeness. They weren't trying to make you jealous. They weren't secretly playing games. They were waiting for evidence. Evidence that you would eventually become disappointed by who they really were. But then something happened that they hadn't anticipated. You kept responding to them with humanity. Not blind acceptance. Not endless tolerance. Humanity. When they were distant, you didn't pretend it didn't hurt. When they disappointed you, you didn't excuse everything. But you also didn't turn one painful moment into a verdict about their entire character. That distinction became impossible for them to ignore. And now the photograph had forced the past into the present. They finally called you. You answered after the second ring. For several seconds, neither of you spoke. You could hear faint traffic through their side of the call. Then a slow breath. I owe you the truth. You looked toward the window. Outside, evening had settled over the neighborhood, leaving the sky washed in deep blue. What truth? Their voice became quieter. The person in that photograph. You waited. That person was the reason I stopped trusting people. A pause. And I became so afraid of being abandoned again that I started creating situations where people could prove me right. The confession landed differently than you expected. There was no dramatic music. No perfect speech. Just a human voice finally admitting something painful. You asked, so you were testing me? Yes. They didn't defend themselves. Yes, I was. Your chest tightened. How many times? They went silent. That silence answered before they did. More than I want to admit. You closed your eyes. There was hurt there. Real hurt. But beneath it was something else. Understanding. You realized the secret wasn't harmless. Their fear had caused real consequences. And loving someone did not mean pretending those consequences didn't matter. You said softly, "You should have trusted me enough to tell me." "I know." Their voice cracked. "I thought if I told you what I was afraid of, you'd start treating me differently. You treated me differently first." Silence. Then they whispered, "I know." For the first time, they didn't try to escape the uncomfortable truth. They stayed there with you inside it. And something changed. Not because everything was suddenly healed. But because neither of you was pretending anymore. Your soulmate told you what happened on the night of the photograph. Years ago, the person beside them had made a promise. They were supposed to meet at a place they both loved, a small overlook outside the city where the lights looked like stars scattered beneath the hills. Your soulmate arrived first. They waited. 10 minutes. 20. An hour. The person never came. Instead, they received one message. "I can't do this anymore." That was all. No explanation. No conversation. No chance to understand. Your soulmate had spent that night sitting alone beneath a cold sky, staring at the road and convincing themselves that they had somehow been too much. Too emotional. Too complicated. Too trusting. Too difficult to stay for. And that night became a private rule. Never let someone get close enough to leave you unexpectedly. So they learned to leave emotionally first. They learned to create distance before attachment became dangerous. They learned to test people before trusting them. They learned to watch for signs of abandonment. And then they met you. You became the one person who made those defenses uncomfortable. Because you noticed things. You noticed when their laugh sounded forced. You noticed when they became unusually quiet. You noticed when they said, "I'm fine," but their eyes said something else. And instead of demanding access to every hidden part of them, you gave them the dignity to reveal themselves in their own time. That was the part they couldn't understand. Why weren't you forcing the door open? Why weren't you demanding proof? Why weren't you becoming angry every time they needed space? They had mistaken your patience for uncertainty. Then one evening, they realized something terrifying. You were giving them freedom. And freedom meant they could no longer blame your presence for their fear. The choice to trust was theirs. That realization changed everything. They told you there was another detail about the photograph they had never shared. The picture had been taken just hours before the night they were abandoned. And on the back of it was a handwritten sentence. They had kept it all these years. They went to find it. You heard drawers opening through the phone. Then footsteps. A moment later, their breathing changed. "I found it." "What does it say?" They didn't answer immediately. When they finally spoke, their voice was almost a whisper. "It says, if you ever feel like you are too much, remember that someone will still choose you." You felt something move inside you. Who wrote that? Another silence. Then they said, the person who left. You couldn't speak. Because suddenly the story became more complicated. The person who had abandoned them had also once recognized their worth. They had loved them. They had believed in them. And yet they had still left. Your soulmate had spent years trying to reconcile those two truths. How could someone genuinely love you and still walk away? How could affection exist alongside abandonment? How could a beautiful connection end without meaning that it was fake? Those questions had shaped the way they understood love. And now you were helping them discover a different answer. Sometimes someone can love you and still lack the courage, maturity, or circumstances required to remain. Their departure does not automatically become proof that you were unworthy. Your soulmate had never learned that. Until now. You could hear them crying quietly. I thought I had to become easier to love. You said nothing. They continued. So I became smaller. Quieter. Less honest. I stopped asking for what I needed. And then when someone got close, I tested them because I wanted them to prove they could handle the person I had hidden. Their words were trembling now. But you didn't fall for the test. You frowned. What do you mean? They laughed softly through their tears. You didn't react the way I expected. You remembered the moments. The times you had chosen not to chase. The times you had spoken honestly instead of dramatically. The times you had said, I care about you, but I can't keep guessing what you need. You hadn't passed because you endured everything. You passed because you remained yourself. That distinction mattered. Your soulmate had discovered that genuine love wasn't demonstrated by how much pain someone could tolerate. It was revealed through honesty, boundaries, patience, accountability, and the courage to remain truthful when emotions became complicated. But there was still one piece missing. The reason they had sent you the photograph that night. You asked them directly. Why now? They became silent. Long enough for you to hear your own heartbeat. Then they said, because I found out something about you. Your expression changed. What? I wasn't looking for it. That sentence immediately made you uneasy. What did you find? I was going through an old conversation. With me? Yes. They inhaled slowly. There was something you wrote years ago. I don't think you remember it. You tried to remember. What did I say? You told me that you hoped I would never stay somewhere just because I was afraid of being alone. Your mind went still. They continued. I realized you weren't only talking about me. What do you mean? I think you were talking about yourself too. The word struck unexpectedly. Because suddenly, the test had turned around. They had spent all this time studying whether you would remain. But perhaps life had been asking you a different question. Would you keep choosing a connection that required you to abandon your own peace? Would you confuse loyalty with endless waiting? Would you sacrifice your dignity simply because you were afraid that walking away from confusion meant walking away from love? Neither of you spoke. Then your soulmate said something that changed the direction of the conversation. I don't want you to prove anything to me anymore. You felt your eyes burn. Then what do you want? I want to learn how to love you without making you audition for it. That sentence stayed between you. For the first time, there was no test. No hidden measurement. No secret experiment. Just a person admitting that fear had been making decisions where love should have been allowed to speak. But then came the final revelation. You thought the photograph explained everything. It didn't. Your soulmate had not sent you the picture merely to explain their past. They had sent it because of what they discovered behind it. When they turned the photograph over that morning, they noticed something they had never seen before. A second name. Written faintly beneath the old sentence. A name they recognized. A name connected to you. Their voice dropped to almost nothing. That person in the photograph. You waited. They knew your family. Your entire body went still. What? I didn't know until today. They began crying again. I found an old box. Inside it was another photograph. And behind that photograph was a letter. Your heart started pounding. What did the letter say? They hesitated. Then came the words that made the entire story suddenly feel different. It said that the person who left me that night had been trying to protect someone. Who? A long pause. Then your soulmate whispered your name. And before you could ask another question, they added. They weren't protecting themselves from me. They were protecting me from something they believed you and I would eventually discover. The call went silent. Your mind raced through every memory. Every coincidence. Every strange connection you had dismissed. Every time your soulmate seemed to recognize something about your life that you had never told them. And then you remembered the first time they ever saw you. The way they looked at you wasn't unfamiliar. It was recognition. Not attraction. Not curiosity. Recognition. As if somewhere, long before your paths crossed, your story had already touched theirs. You whispered, "What was in the letter?" They didn't answer. You could hear paper moving. Then their breathing stopped for a moment. I don't know how to tell you this. Just tell me. I found the last page. What does it say? Their voice broke. It says that if we ever found each other. A pause. We were never supposed to know the truth this way. You waited. Then they read the final line aloud. And the moment you heard it, every assumption you had made about your connection began to collapse. Because the person who had tested your love in secret had just discovered something neither of you was prepared to face. The test had not begun when your soulmate started pulling away. It had begun years before either of you met. And someone from your shared past had been waiting all this time for you to finally find out why. For several seconds after the final sentence, neither of you spoke. The silence was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with the weight of everything that had finally surfaced. Your soulmate was still holding the old letter. You could hear the faint rustle of paper through the phone, followed by a shaky breath. Then they said, "I think I finally understand why I was so afraid of you." You swallowed. Why? Because you didn't feel unfamiliar. The words landed softly. You felt like someone I had been meant to understand eventually. There was no supernatural claim in the moment, no perfect explanation that suddenly made every painful choice disappear. There was simply the strange reality of two people discovering that their histories had brushed against one another long before their hearts knew what it meant. The person in the photograph had once known someone from your family. Years earlier, that connection had brought your lives close without either of you realizing it. The letter wasn't a prophecy. It wasn't a secret command. It was simply one person's desperate attempt to leave behind a warning and a hope. The warning was that fear could make people destroy something precious before they ever gave it a chance. The hope was that, someday, the people involved would become brave enough to tell the truth. Your soulmate had spent years carrying only the warning. You had unknowingly carried the hope. And now both were finally sitting in the same conversation. They told you everything. The person who had left them had not abandoned them because they were unlovable. That person had been overwhelmed by circumstances they didn't know how to handle. They had made choices out of fear and then disappeared rather than face the consequences. It had hurt. Deeply. But your soulmate had spent years turning someone else's inability to stay into a judgment against their own worth. That was the lie they had been living inside. And the secret tests were simply another expression of it. They wanted someone to prove the old story wrong. But every time they tested someone, they created the very uncertainty they feared. You finally said, "You know, you don't have to test me anymore. I know. You don't have to make me prove that I'm staying. I know. And you don't have to stay just because you're afraid of losing me." There was a long pause. Then came the answer you never expected. "I know." Their voice was different now. Steadier. Not because the fear had disappeared, but because they were no longer allowing fear to make every decision. "I want to choose you," they said, "without making you earn the choice." Your eyes filled with tears. Because that was the real discovery. Not that you had passed some secret test. Not that you had somehow endured enough to deserve love. But that love was never supposed to be an examination where one person constantly performs and the other constantly judges. Love was supposed to become a place where two imperfect people could tell the truth, take responsibility, grow, and choose each other freely. Your soulmate had finally understood that. And you understood something too. You could forgive the fear without excusing the behavior. You could understand their past without allowing the past to control your future. You could love them without becoming responsible for healing every wound they carried. That boundary changed the relationship more than any romantic promise could have. The next time you saw each other, neither of you arrived with a rehearsed speech. There was no dramatic scene. No perfect soundtrack. Just two people sitting across from one another in a quiet cafe while afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the table. Your soulmate looked at you for a long time. Then smiled. "I thought I was studying you." You smiled back. You were. They laughed softly. And somehow I ended up studying myself. That was the moment the tension finally broke. You both laughed. Not because the past was funny. Because after so much confusion, there was relief in being able to breathe again. They reached across the table. You hesitated for half a second. Then you took their hand. No promise was demanded. No future was guaranteed. There was simply warmth, presence, choice. And for the first time, their hand wasn't reaching for you because they were afraid you might leave. It was reaching for you because they were no longer afraid to stay. Over the weeks that followed, things did not become magically perfect. There were still difficult conversations. There were moments when old habits returned. Sometimes your soulmate would become quiet and instinctively pull inward. But now they said, "I'm scared," instead of disappearing. And you learned to say, "I'm here, but let's talk honestly," instead of pretending nothing had happened. That was the real healing. Not the absence of problems. The presence of truth. One evening, months later, your soulmate brought the old photograph back to you. They had kept it for years. Now they placed it on the table between you. "I don't need this anymore," they said. You looked at the photograph. "What will you do with it?" They smiled. "Keep it." You raised an eyebrow. "Then why say you don't need it?" "Because there's a difference." They turned the photograph over. "I don't need it to remind me why I was afraid." Their finger rested over the faded handwriting. "Now it reminds me how far I've come." That sentence stayed with you. Because sometimes healing doesn't mean destroying every reminder of the past. Sometimes it means looking at the thing that once controlled you and realizing it no longer owns you. The old photograph remained. The letter remained. The memories remained. But their meaning had changed. And perhaps that was what changed everything. Not that your soulmate discovered you were willing to tolerate every test. They discovered something much more valuable. They discovered that you could love them without losing yourself. They discovered that honesty could survive discomfort. They discovered that boundaries did not mean rejection. They discovered that vulnerability did not guarantee abandonment. And most importantly, they discovered that being truly known did not have to end in being left. One quiet night, you asked them a question. "Why did you finally tell me everything?" They looked at you. "Because I realized something." "What?" "If I kept testing whether you would stay, I'd never get to experience what it felt like to actually be with you." You smiled. "And what does it feel like?" They took your hand. Peaceful. Not perfect. Not effortless. Peaceful. And that one word carried more meaning than all the dramatic promises either of you could have made. The mystery had finally been resolved. Your soulmate had tested your love in secret because they were terrified that genuine closeness would eventually expose them as unworthy. But what they discovered wasn't that you would endlessly chase them. They discovered that your love had depth without requiring self-abandonment. They discovered that you could remain compassionate and still tell the truth. They discovered that you could forgive without forgetting. They discovered that love could be chosen freely instead of extracted through fear. And you discovered something too. Sometimes the person standing in front of you isn't fighting against your love. Sometimes they are fighting against everything that happened before your love arrived. That doesn't mean you must rescue them. It means you should never confuse another person's fear with your own worth. You are allowed to walk away from confusion. You are allowed to ask for honesty. You are allowed to love deeply without surrendering your peace. And if someone truly wants to build something meaningful with you, they must eventually meet you in the light of truth, not keep you trapped inside a maze of unanswered questions. Your soulmate eventually understood that. And that was the moment the secret test ended. Not when you passed. When they finally realized there had never been a test worth taking. There was only a choice. 2 people. 2 histories. 2 imperfect hearts. And 1 opportunity to stop repeating old patterns. The photograph that once represented abandonment became a reminder of courage. The letter that once carried fear became a reminder of truth. And the person who once tested whether you would stay finally learned how to stay without testing you. So if this fictional story found a quiet place inside your heart, remember this. You do not have to prove that you are worthy of being loved. You do not have to chase someone into choosing you. You do not have to become smaller so someone else can feel secure. The right kind of love will not require you to disappear. It will invite you to become more honest, more grounded, more yourself. And if someone from your past or your present is learning how to love you more honestly, let that growth happen through truth, not pressure, manipulation, or fear. Let action speak. Let consistency speak. Let time reveal what words cannot. And whatever happens next in your own story, may you have the courage to recognize love when it arrives without mistaking anxiety for destiny. May your heart become lighter. May old disappointments lose their power over your future. May you stop carrying responsibility for wounds you did not create. May you have wisdom when someone approaches you with sincerity, strength when someone approaches you with confusion, and peace when you realize that not every ending is a failure. And may the love meant for your life, whether it is renewed, newly discovered, or found within yourself, meet you with honesty, respect, patience, and freedom. May you never again believe that you must pass a secret test to deserve someone's heart. May you remember that you are already worthy of being known. And when someone finally chooses you without games, without hidden conditions, without making you prove your value, may you have the courage to recognize the difference. If this story spoke to something deep inside you, stay connected to this channel for more cinematic inspirational stories about love, healing, hope, and the unexpected turns that can transform a heart. And if you believe someone out there needs this reminder tonight, share this video with them. Sometimes one story reaches a person at exactly the moment they needed to hear it. And perhaps this was yours.